Mark Carney's folder contained evidence of secret agreements between Western corporations. Ibrahim Traoré held his phone with encoded CIA messages in his pocket. On CNN's live broadcast, a world-shaking revelation was moments away. Host Christine Laurent's hand began to tremble. Panic-filled instructions coming through her earpiece as the studio lights suddenly dimmed, her face transforming into an expression of fear. The CNN studio in New York was a marvel of modern broadcast technology. Crystal-clear screens lined the walls, displaying global markets in real time. The sleek circular table at the center gleamed under carefully positioned lights. Global Perspectives, read the digital banner crawling beneath the main camera. Today's topic: resource sovereignty, reality or illusion. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. CNN executives had been promoting this discussion for weeks, billing it as a first-ever meeting between two of the most controversial leaders on the world stage. Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, and Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. Two men from vastly different worlds, representing countries whose paths rarely crossed in global politics. Christine Laurent, CNN's senior international correspondent, sat poised at the center. Her reputation for hard-hitting interviews had made her a network star. Behind her practiced smile, however, was the confidence of someone who knew exactly how this conversation was meant to go. "Welcome back to Global Perspectives," Laurent began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Today we're joined by two leaders whose nations are grappling with resource sovereignty issues. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada and President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The camera panned to show both men seated across from her. Carney in his characteristic navy suit, his posture straight but relaxed. Traoré in a dark formal suit with subtle traditional details, his expression reserved but alert. "Gentlemen, thank you for joining us," Laurent continued. "Let's begin with the central question. In today's interconnected world, can smaller economies truly have resource sovereignty when faced with pressures from global superpowers?" Her eyes fixed on Traoré first, a calculated decision. Her producers had determined he would be the easier target. "President Traoré, your country has made bold moves against French mining interests. But with Burkina Faso's GDP less than 0.01% of global output, aren't these gestures ultimately symbolic rather than sustainable?" The question hung in the air, its premise clear. Small nations must accept their place in the hierarchy. Traoré's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could answer, Carney spoke. "If I may," Carney interjected, his voice measured, "I think we need to reframe that question. Resource sovereignty isn't about a nation's size, but about its right to determine how its natural wealth benefits its people." Laurent blinked, momentarily caught off guard. This wasn't the dynamic she had expected. The two leaders were supposed to represent different worlds, different approaches. "Prime Minister Carney, Canada's relationship with the United States is hardly comparable to Burkina Faso's colonial history with France," she countered. Traoré leaned forward. "Actually, Ms. Laurent, there are more parallels than you might acknowledge. Both our nations have seen resources flow outward, while profits rarely return to our communities. The difference is perhaps only in scale, not in substance." Laurent's earpiece crackled. "Push back harder," came the producer's voice. "Separate them." "But surely, President Traoré," she pressed, "your methods, military coups, nationalization, are far more destabilizing than Canada's diplomatic approach?" Carney's gaze met Traoré's briefly. Something unspoken passed between them. "Ms. Laurent," Carney said, reaching for his briefcase, "I think we're operating on some flawed assumptions here." He pulled out a blue folder, placing it deliberately on the table. "I've brought something that might provide context." Traoré nodded slightly and reached into his jacket pocket, removing his phone. "As have I." Laurent's eyes darted between the folder and the phone. "This wasn't in the briefing. We'll get to your materials shortly, gentlemen, but first, I think now is the appropriate time," Traoré said firmly, "especially given your framing of this discussion." The studio suddenly felt smaller. Laurent touched her earpiece instinctively as urgent voices flooded through. "Cut to commercial," someone was saying. "Stall them." But Carney had already opened the folder. This document outlines trade agreements between Canada and the United States that were never made public. Specifically, provisions that give American companies priority access to Canadian water reserves and energy grids during times of market instability, a term left deliberately vague. Traoré held up his phone. "And I have here a series of messages between CIA operatives and certain journalists, some employed by this very network, outlining the recommended framing for stories about African resource management. The explicit goal, to present African ownership models as unstable and undesirable. Laurent's composure cracked. "We need to take a commercial break." "I don't think we do," Carney said, his tone still polite but unyielding. "Your viewers deserve to hear this." The control room was in chaos. The director was shouting about contractual obligations and editorial control. But the broadcast continued, now completely off script. "These documents," Carney continued, "reveal a consistent pattern across Western media and financial institutions. The narrative isn't shaped by objective reporting, but by predetermined conclusions. Resource-rich nations that don't conform to Western economic models are portrayed as unstable, corrupt, or incapable." Traoré nodded. "The same strategies used against Burkina Faso are deployed against Canada, just with different intensity. When we removed French companies from our gold mines, we were descending into chaos. When Canada considers limits on foreign ownership of its energy sector, it's creating market uncertainty." The lights in the studio flickered momentarily. Laurent's hand visibly trembled as she touched her earpiece again. "We seem to be having some technical difficulties," she said weakly. "No," Carney said. "What we're having is a moment of clarity." He placed a document on the table, sliding it toward Laurent. "This is an internal memo from the International Banking Forum dated 3 months ago. It explicitly discusses strategies to manage public perception of resource nationalization movements. CNN is listed as a priority media partner for distributing the preferred narrative." Laurent didn't touch the paper. Her producer was now frantically instructing her to shut down the conversation, but Traoré was already speaking. "Last year, Burkina Faso increased its retained mining revenue by 42% by renegotiating contracts with Western companies. The result? Our credit rating was downgraded within weeks. Not because of any economic fundamentals, but because we challenged the established order. Canada faced similar, if more subtle, consequences when we blocked the sale of Arctic shipping routes to American firms," Carney added. Suddenly, international publications were running stories questioning Canada's economic stability. Laurent's professional mask was slipping. "These are serious allegations that would require verification." "The verification is right here," Carney said, tapping the folder. "We've provided copies to several independent news organizations which will be publishing their findings within hours." Traoré leaned forward. "Ms. Laurent, this interview was presented to us as a discussion about resource sovereignty. Instead, it appears to be an attempt to reinforce narratives that serve particular interests." He held up his phone. "I have the original correspondence with your producers. The planned questions, which I'm sure differ from what you were instructed to ask, make the agenda quite clear." The studio fell silent. Even the voices in Laurent's earpiece seemed to have gone quiet. After several seconds, Carney spoke again, his tone surprisingly gentle. "We're not here to attack CNN specifically. This network is part of a larger system. What we're challenging is the assumption that nations like Burkina Faso, or even Canada, must accept external control of their resources as the natural order." Laurent found her voice. "Our viewers would certainly be interested in examining any evidence of media bias, but making such claims without allowing our team to review the documents is—" "Your team has had these documents for 2 weeks, Traoré interrupted. "We sent them to your editorial board before agreeing to this interview. They were marked background, not for discussion. That should tell you everything you need to know." The control room erupted again. The executive producer was now on the line, demanding to know who had received these documents and why he hadn't been informed. On screen, Laurent's professional composure had completely abandoned her. "I was not made aware of any documents provided in advance," she said, genuine confusion mixing with embarrassment. "That's our point exactly," Carney said. "The system is designed to compartmentalize information, to ensure that even well-meaning journalists operate within acceptable boundaries without realizing those boundaries exist." Traoré nodded. "The same methods used to control the narrative about African nations are used everywhere, just with varying degrees of subtlety." Laurent's earpiece was now delivering a stream of contradictory instructions. Some voices were calling for an immediate end to the broadcast. Others were arguing that cutting now would only validate the claims being made. In the midst of this chaos, Carney made an unexpected move. He stood up, walked around the table, and sat in an empty chair next to Traoré. The visual was powerful. The leaders of a G7 nation and an African state literally on the same side of the table. "What we're proposing," Carney said, looking directly into the camera, "is a new framework for discussing resource sovereignty. One that doesn't begin with the assumption that smaller economies must surrender control to be properly integrated into the global system." Traoré nodded. Whether we're talking about Canadian water, Burkina gold, or any nation's natural wealth, the fundamental principle should be the same. Those resources belong first to the people of that country. The camera operator, acting without direction from the now chaotic control room, zoomed out to capture both men sitting side by side, facing Laurent across the table. The symbolic power of the image was undeniable. "We came here today knowing exactly how this interview was meant to go," Carney continued. "We were supposed to represent two different worlds, the reasonable Western approach versus the radical African one. But the reality is, we're facing the same pressures, just at different intensities." Laurent had given up on receiving coherent direction from her producers. In a moment of professional instinct, she decided to lean into the unexpected situation. "You're suggesting that there's an orchestrated effort to prevent resource-rich nations from exercising full sovereignty?" "Not just suggesting," Traoré said. "We've documented it." He gestured to Carney's folder and his own phone. "Across continents, across political systems, the pattern is consistent. When nations assert control over their resources, they face remarkably similar responses in global media and financial markets." Carney nodded. "The narrative is always about stability and investor confidence, never about whether citizens benefit from their own natural wealth." The studio lights flickered again, more pronouncedly this time. Someone in the control room had apparently decided that technical difficulties might be the least damaging way to end the broadcast. Laurent, seeing what was happening, made a split-second decision. "Before we lose connection, I want to ask both of you, what do you hope to achieve by coming forward with these allegations?" Carney and Traoré exchanged a glance. "We're not just representing our two countries," Traoré said. "We're speaking for dozens of nations that have faced the same patterns of economic coercion and narrative manipulation." "This isn't about politics or ideology," Carney added. "It's about transparency. About acknowledging that the current system isn't the natural order but a constructed one, and if it's constructed, it can be reconstructed more fairly." The studio lights dimmed further, and Laurent's microphone began to cut out. But before the feed was lost completely, viewers around the world heard Traoré's final words. "Whether in Africa or North America, resource sovereignty isn't just about who owns what's in the ground. It's about who controls the story told about those resources. Today, we're changing that story." The broadcast cut to an emergency commercial break, but it was too late. The unscripted conversation had already gone live to millions of viewers worldwide. Within minutes, clips were circulating on social media. The documents referenced by both leaders were being uploaded to various platforms. Whilst Resource Truth and Des Carntroir Exposé were trending globally. In the darkened CNN studio, Laurent sat in stunned silence, her earpiece now oddly quiet. Across from her, Carney and Traoré remained side by side, the visual embodiment of an unexpected alliance that had just upended the global conversation about resource sovereignty. As the emergency lights came on, a production assistant rushed in with an urgent message. The network executives were demanding an immediate meeting, but something else was happening too. Journalists from other networks were already gathering in the lobby, requesting comments on what some were already calling the most significant media moment of the decade. The story that was meant to reinforce old narratives had instead shattered them completely. And as Carney and Traoré walked out of the studio together, their unexpected alliance suggested that the conversation about global resources would never be quite the same again.